Okay, what is up there, YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on World War II tanks that are still being used in the ongoing conflict in Yemen. Now, Yemen is a current battlefield that is happening as of this year, 2019, but there will probably be still a conflict there for at least the next 5 to 10 years in some way, shape, or form. Now, in the Yemen conflict, there are a variety of World War II weapons being used, but the most interesting are the World War II era tanks like the T-34-85 and the Su-100 tank destroyer. Now, these tanks are being used by pretty much all sides in the conflict. Now, the Yemen civil war or civil conflict is pretty much a multi-sided conflict. There's no two sides. There's at least 3 or 4 different factions fighting in the Yemen war. You have the Houthi factions that are supposedly backed by Iran, or the Houthi militias that are backed by Iran, supposedly. You also have the Al Hadi forces backed by Saudi Arabia. You also have the South Yemen forces backed by the UAE and the other smaller Gulf states. And you also have 2 jihadi factions fighting in Yemen. You have Al-Qaeda in Yemen, and you also have ISIL in Yemen, or ISIS in Yemen, also known in Arabic as Daesh. Now, all of these factions have been spotted using T-34-85s and also Su-100 tank destroyers, mostly in places like Sana'a, Marib, El Hazm, Idlib, Taiz, and especially on the newer battleground of El Hudaydah, which is a port city in the eastern half of Yemen in Houthi territory. Now, these T-34 tanks are in a variety of different shapes, and they are in various states of either repair or disrepair. Some of these vehicles are 100% functional, as they were during the Second World War, and some of these vehicles are also partially used, meaning that these vehicles are used as either dug-in vehicles with no engines, or in some cases these vehicles have no turrets, or their turrets have been damaged, so the user of the vehicle is usually standing outside of the vehicle firing using a lanyard, firing the T-34's 85mm gun using a lanyard or a line. The Su-100 tank destroyers seem to be in tip-top condition. Most of these vehicles seem to have come from either their World War II vintage storage areas in Yemen. There are some areas where World War II vintage weapons are stored, like tanks and artillery. There are also a lot of World War II era rifles, like Mosin Nagats, some German Mauser K98s, a lot of old PPSH-41s, and even some rare American weapons like M1 Garands and M3 grease guns have been spotted here and there in Yemen. Now, going back to the T-34 tanks, these tanks come from a variety of different eras. Some of these are from World War II, although it is probably the bottom 20%. At least 20% of these T-34-85s are from the Second World War, but most of these are actually post-war T-34-85s that were built in the 1950s and 60s in places like the COM bloc countries, for example, the Eastern bloc countries like Czechoslovakia, and some were built in Poland, but some were also World War II vintage tanks that were restored in the 50s and 60s and later sold to Yemen back during the original Yemen Civil War of 1962 through 1967. And those were actually 2 separate wars, but they're considered one major conflict. But these T-34 tanks date back to around that time period. These tanks were delivered in the 50s and 60s and have been used and are currently being used in the ongoing Yemen Civil War. Now, the Su-100 tank destroyers are also a mixed bag. Some of these are original World War II tanks that were refurbished later on, and some of these are post-war manufacturings that were manufactured in Czechoslovakia in the 50s and 60s and later sold to Yemen in the 60s and 70s. And these Su-100 tank destroyers have been spotted in use by pretty much all sides. Now, there is an estimated 60 to 80 T-34-85 tanks in Yemen altogether. At least half of these are in use in one way, shape, or form. The number of Su-100s is pretty low. The highest estimate I could find on the number of Su-100s operating in Yemen is anywhere from 25 to 30. Now, the Su-100 is largely being used by the pro-Houthi forces in the South Yemen movement, which are backed by the Saudi government and the UAE governments, for example. I've seen a lot of these Su-100s in the military parades held in southern Yemen, while the T-34-85 seems to be largely used by the Houthi militias, along with some of the other lesser-known Saudi-backed militias in the areas of Taiz, Idlib, Sana'a City, and the Marib area. At least one or two T-34s have been spotted in the El Hudaydah area. Now, the saddest part about this video is that a lot of these old World War II tanks have been destroyed in Yemen. I have seen videos of T-34-85s being hit with ATMGs or anti-tank guided missiles, and I've also seen video footage of Su-100s also being hit with anti-tank guided missiles, So it's kind of sad seeing these old World War II relics being destroyed, but, that's war, and these vehicles were created for war. So what do you think of these old T-34-85s and Su-100 tank destroyers being used in Yemen? How long do you think this conflict will last? I say the Yemen war will probably last another 5 to 10 years, but, that's just an estimate. But what do you all think of these World War II tanks in Yemen and these other World War II weapons in Yemen? It's not just tanks being used. There's a lot of World War II infantry weapons, artillery, and vehicles outside of tanks that are being used in Yemen. But what do you all think? Please tell me in the comment section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off.
الجيش واللجان الشعبية تكون مستعدة بعد. الآن والحمد لله تم إحراق طق معدل 23 من حق العدو في جبهة دمت. أبطال الجيش واللجان الشعبية بإحراق طق محمل في جبهة الطائف دمت وما النصر إلا من عند الله. الله أكبر. الموت لأمريكا، الموت لإسرائيل، اللعنة على اليهود، النصر لإسرائيل.
Завода прут и труд колхозных пахарь, мы защитим свою края. Ударной силой орудийный пахарь, и вы напойте нас огня. Гремя огнем, сверкаем лес.
هذه أحد الدبابات التي يقترمها عن جهة الجيش واللجان الشعبية في تعتبر الضارة والنصر إلا من عندنا بإخراج الغنائم التي داخلها من دجاجها وما من سلاح وذخائر أجنحة متوسطة وخفيفة. هي أحد الدبابات وهي تم إخراجها قبل أيام في الجيش واللجان الشعبية. قوة تتغيرت. الموت الموت إسرائيل، اللعنة على اليهود، النصر
Когда над бой пошлет товарищ Сталин, и первый маршал воинов поведет. Когда над бой пошлет товарищ Сталин, и первый маршал воинов поведет. А если к нам полезет враг матерый, он будет бит повсюду и везде. Тогда на круг водители, стартовы, и по лесам, по сопкам, по воде. Гремя огнем, сверкая блеском стали, пойдут машины в яростный поток. Когда на бой поклёт товарищ стали,